she was always conscious that she should share her ability to quilt.
How she found time to do the kind of quilt work that she did, I have never understood.
They were made to keep you warm in the winter. In Arizona, you didn't really need them in the summer.
It's nice to see things that women did 100 years ago are still around. Not quite as disposable as most of the things we do.
Arizona in the 1800s was a harsh land. It was a brave woman who ventured into this little-known territory. She was often the wife or daughter of a soldier, a rancher, a farmer, or a miner. He worked to protect settlers, build a business, or find a fortune, while she raised a family, organized a church, and started a school. She brought to Arizona all the skills she had learned from her mother and grandmother. In addition to raising her children, she raised a garden and canned fruits and vegetables. She churned butter, tended chickens, and milked the family cow. And she knew how to use a gun, cut wood, and haul water. She also sewed the family's clothes and made bedding to keep them warm at night. The adage, "a woman's work is never done," was never more true than for pioneer Arizona women. But making do with what she had was not new. These hardy Arizona women could draw from experience passed on to them by generations of women. The patchwork quilt is uniquely American. When cloth was scarce, colonial women made use of every scrap, sewing together bits and pieces of familiar cloth to make warm bed covers. Not content to simply sew the pieces together, women stitched the patches into patterns. They shared the patterns with friends and over the years gave them names. Double wedding ring, grandmother's flower garden, drunkard's path, and Lone Star. The colorful patterns of their quilts added a spot of brightness to their homes and their lives. And unlike most of the daily chores that filled a woman's life, the work of making a quilt rewarded her with a tangible creation that could be used, admired, and even passed on to future generations. In 1870, the census of the Arizona Territory lists less than 300 women, ages 16 to 59. Of these, most were Mexican women. Many, like Atancia Santa Cruz Hughes, married Anglo men and learned the American tradition of quilt making. Her quilts reflect Arizona's blending of cultures, with Mexican religious symbols stitched into the center of a traditional American pattern. Life was hard as settlers fought Indians for control of the land. Atancia Hughes recalled the spring of 1871 in Tucson. The Indians had been very bad all winter, and they got very bold and kept coming closer and closer and closer, right up to our very doors. As life became more settled, more women arrived to civilize Arizona towns. Their quilts wrapped newborns and cushioned the bumps and covered wagons. They were a link to families left behind, often never to be seen again. And sometimes they were a record of family and community history. In 1882, Jane Nugent Hart was preparing to leave Wisconsin to join her husband Lum in Tombstone, Arizona. Family and friends surprised her with this friendship quilt to remember them. She wrote to Lum, "Dear husband, there has been a raid on the house. I was sitting very quietly knitting when in walked 36 of the citizens with their supper. I felt weak in the knees. Then after supper, they presented me with an album quilt with all the old names. I wish you could see it." Such a quilt was more than just a practical gift. For many women, making a quilt was also a social occasion. Many women lived for weeks and even months on isolated farms or ranches. Getting together to work on a quilt gave a woman a chance to join with other women in the family, friends, and neighbors to make the work go faster and to share news of the community. Worries, joys, hopes, fears, births, and deaths were discussed over the quilt frame. The resulting quilt warmed the soul as well as the body. Young girls were taught early the skills of sewing and quilt making. Starting when their small hands were able to work scissors, they learned to cut the many patches needed. In the late 1800s, it became fashionable to use elegant fabrics and fancy embroidery to make what were called crazy quilts. Women in the Arizona Territory were far removed from fashions of the East, but they kept in touch with the latest styles. And in Arizona, too, they used their time and talents to create beautiful crazy quilts that could compete with those of their Eastern sisters. Many of these unique quilts contain dated ribbons made to commemorate special events. In 1885, this quilt was stitched in Jerome, Arizona, in honor of President Grover Cleveland's visit to the Arizona Territory. Crazy quilts also celebrated significant family events. Between 1880 and the 1890s, Clara Parton Greenleaf made this quilt to record the births of each of her 5 children. The initials of each child are embroidered on the quilt. Clara had come to Yuma, Arizona in 1881. She came with her husband, who worked for the railroad and was a deputy sheriff. Crazy quilts were often made with fabric ribbons and gave the maker an opportunity to show off her needlework skill with fancy embroidery. Nellie Smith used hundreds of tiny ribbons collected from the necks of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer bottles, sewn together to form a tumbling block pattern. The quilt maker, Nellie von Gerichten Smith, collected the ribbons from her husband's business, the Palace Saloon in Prescott. Nellie sometimes entertained at the Palace, always accompanied by her mother. Nellie was also said to be the first woman to play violin with the San Francisco Philharmonic Orchestra. In addition, she gave children music lessons and wrote many musical scores, children's stories, and poems. During the 2 decades before Arizona became a state, life became more settled. The Indian Wars ended, and this new sense of security allowed many communities to grow and develop some of the refinements of Eastern society. In 1895, a group of women that called themselves the Monday Club took books from their own homes and started the first library in Prescott. Mary Smith came to Arizona to work as a Harvey House girl, one of many young women who came west to work at the chain of tourist hotels established by Fred Harvey. Through that job, she met the Corticelli family, owners of a large silk factory in the east. Mary came to Prescott, Arizona in 1894 to work in the Burke Hotel. In 1903, she married William Lawlor, the brother of the Hillside Mine discoverer. After she married, she lived 14 years at the Hillside Mine near Baghdad. Her daughter-in-law, Helen Young, heard many stories about those days.
She could step right in and do the cooking, or if they needed the gold weighed and they were short of help, she could do that. She was very, very versatile.
Mary even helped drive the wagon to haul supplies to the mine. It was a 32-mile ride by wagon just to pick up the mail, but she was sometimes rewarded with a bundle of silk samples from the Corticellis. To relax in the evenings by lamplight, Mary would piece quilts from these colorful bits of silk.
She was very conscious of having something beautiful, like her quilts. They were practical, and it was just wonderful for her to be able to sit occasionally and work on her quilts. It was just a very hard life, but she never thought of it as a hard life, as long as she could do handwork. And she just thought that a woman I, in quotes, was almost useless that couldn't sew. And she said the 14 years that she spent at the mine were the happiest years of her life.
Mary and Jake Ritter were also pioneers in this part of the Arizona Territory. Mary made this log cabin quilt in about 1905 when she was living on a ranch near Hillside. It was a wedding gift for her son Ed Ritter and his bride. Mary died in 1911 before her grandson Curtis was born, but when he got the quilt, it still had a small note attached.
It says this quilt was made for Ed Ritter by his mother to give to his son.
The Ritters first traveled through Arizona in 1863 on their way from Texas to California. They settled in California and made friends with some Indians there, and Mary Ritter was warned by a squaw that there would be an uprising.
Sure enough, they went on into San Diego, and that night the Indians did kill everyone in that area and burned anything that would burn. And so that probably saved all their lives at least. And my grandfather had remembered this area with the grass so high and so beautiful west of Prescott that they went through, that he'd always kind of been sorry he didn't stay there to begin with. So they came back, and they got back about 1868.
Mary Ritter was one of the first white women to settle in the Arizona Territory. She had 12 children, but only 7 grew to adulthood. The family raised cattle and had a large garden. They would sell fresh fruits and vegetables to travelers along the old Ehrenberg wagon road.
How she found time to do the kind of quilt work that she did, I have never understood. And when I look at that thing, I can't see how anybody could do that fine work anyway, that little tiny stitches that you can't hardly see.
Like the Ritters, many of Arizona's early settlers did not come directly from the east. Instead, they took the more established routes to California and Oregon. Then when they heard about opportunities in the Arizona Territory, these adventurous souls struck out again. The Van Deren family began its trek east across the California desert in 1876. The family of 10 increased to 11 when Ida Mae was born in a covered carriage in Big Pine, Nevada. After scouting out many areas of Arizona, Godfrey Van Deren finally settled his family in the Verde Valley in 1878. Ida Mae grew up there to marry Alfred Dickinson. Together they ran the Pine Hotel in Flagstaff. Ida Mae raised 4 children and made many quilts that are still cherished by her grandchildren. By the turn of the century, Tempe had become a thriving community with the growth of the Tempe Normal School for Teachers and the Hayden Flour Mill. In 1899, the Ladies' Aid Society, the first Christian church in Tempe, had the Arizona Territorial Legislators sign blocks of white fabric. The ladies embroidered the signatures in red and planned to make them into a quilt to raise funds for the church. Women often use their needlework skills to raise funds for ambitious building projects. They help to build hospitals, churches, schools, and libraries. This quilt was made in Phoenix to raise money for the Red Cross. Arizona's entry into statehood marked a new period of growth and prosperity. Those coming to settle here were no longer pioneers in a frontier territory, but residents of our nation's youngest state. Ruth Wolfe Jordan came to Tempe in 1912. She was 10 years old. Her uncle had written to his family in the South about the building of Roosevelt Dam and the growth and prosperity that was coming to the area. When the Wolfe family came to Arizona, they brought many quilts with them. Then one day, a fire in their Tempe home destroyed nearly all of the family's possessions. But when Ruth's mother opened the charred wardrobe that held the family bedding, she found that the tightly packed quilts still had some undamaged sections in the middle. So she carefully cut out the good parts, and from the family heirlooms, she created 2 very unusual quilts. This ability to make do in the worst of circumstances served Arizona pioneer women well. Quilt making taught young girls practical lessons about sewing and sticking with a chore until it was done. This quilt was made in 1899 by an 8-year-old girl in Payson. At the turn of the century, the Payson area was still largely an untamed wilderness, but quilting was part of that rugged life. Alice Gillette Haught was one of Payson's pioneers. She made these sugans, or camp quilts. They are truly crazy quilts, but quilts made to be used on cold winter nights. Her granddaughter, Pat Klein, still has a ranch in Star Valley and lives in one of the early settlers' homes. Pat has fond memories of her grandmother and her quilts.
But I know that grandmother wasn't too particular about what she put on those quilts. If it got a hole in it, she patched it with something. And she did her clothes the same way. And those quilts show you just about what her dresses looked like. Just about of a whatness. I remember a dress she had that was print, and somewhere she got some brown velvet, and she just sewed it right on there. Lengthened those sleeves right out. And she was real long on velvet. See that? See, there's green velvet, and this was a piece of black velvet. All real long on velvet, I know, or anything fancy. That house was so, about like that barn, just so plain, the wood floor. And if you want to know the truth, those quilts are the most colorful thing I can ever remember in her life.
Many Arizona towns were founded by members of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, or Mormons. The Mormon movement into Arizona began in the late 1870s along the Little Colorado River. Farming communities were established along that river and down the eastern side of the territory. The community of Pomerene in southern Arizona was founded in 1912 by Mormon missionaries fleeing from Pancho Villa and his troops during the Mexican Revolution.
They cleared the land and started farming, started building a canal so they could farm.
Etheline Scott Bailey was born that same year and grew up in Pomerene. Quilting was part of her daily life then and now.
You plant your garden? Yeah, Bill has a garden. We're having trouble with rabbits and squirrels eating it at the moment.
I don't know how old I was when I started quilting, but my mother always had a quilt hanging in the ceiling.
That's the way with Mama too, not always, but I can remember them hanging. Some of her quilts were tied, but most of them were quilted because they lasted longer quilted. Well, we used them all the time. It took quite a number for 12 children.
Most quilts in these Mormon communities were scrap quilts. They made practical use of leftover pieces of cloth, and over the years, most of these quilts were used up and worn out. But some quilts were special. During the 1930s, Etheline belonged to the Relief Society in Pomerene.
When anyone had a birthday, we each made a block and put our name on it. And then we gave her these set of blocks, which was enough for a quilt. And that's how I got that friendship quilt in 1937.
Quilts were also frequently made as gifts to celebrate births or marriages. More of these quilts have survived, treasured by families for generations. Most residents of Arizona in the early 20th century worked somehow in jobs related to the famous 3 C's: copper, cattle, and cotton. The quilts from this period reflect the simple, hard lives of the women, working beside their husbands to build better lives for their families. Quilt maker Janie Craig Follett worked as a ranch cook. Making something out of nothing has long been the tradition of quilt makers. They often recycled feed sacks, sugar sacks, and flour sacks. Even the colorful premiums that came in cigar boxes were put to use. Lottie Hazelwood carefully dyed and stitched Bull Durham tobacco sacks to create an H for Hazelwood in this original quilt. She collected the small tobacco sacks when she lived at Castle Dome, a small railroad station near Douglas. Pearl Chambers and Wilcox created this warm brick wall pattern quilt by using wool pieces from a tailor's sample book. Quilters often stitched scraps together in simple patterns that created striking designs. Quilts that were both useful and beautiful were created from the most humble materials. Sometimes the results were also most unusual. Through the centuries, quilt patterns have been passed from one woman to another, and at times particular styles of quilts have enjoyed special popularity. In the 1930s, quilt making enjoyed a new surge of interest. Magazines and newspapers printed quilt patterns, spreading certain styles quickly across the country. From Arizona to New England, quilts depicting a country girl known as Sunbonnet Sue and her brother Overall Sam were favorites. Other simple objects were also depicted by quilt makers. This clipper ship was made by a ranch wife in the Verde Valley. Some quilts have always been more works of art than simple bed covers. The flurry of quilt making in the 30s sparked this artistic yearning in a number of Arizona quilters. Rose Livingston came from Indiana to Yuma, Arizona in 1880 at the age of 15. She was a dressmaker and hat maker in Yuma. Rose didn't begin to quilt until she was in her 60s. She enjoyed working with colors and skillfully stitched intricate flowers that she designed herself, making quilts to give to each of her grandchildren. Rose did all of the fine applique work on the tops and then had them quilted by the Mormon Relief Society. Emma Andrus was born in Prescott in 1902. She made her first quilt in 1931 from a kit she ordered through a woman's magazine. By 1933, her original design quilt, Silhouette, won an award at the Chicago World's Fair. That was just the first of many spectacular quilts Emma would make, using religious, patriotic, and southwestern themes.
Out where the hand clasp's a little stronger, out where the smile dwells a little longer, that's where the West begins. Out where the sun is a little brighter, where the snows that fall are a trifle whiter, where the bonds of home are a wee bit tighter, that's where the West begins.
Many of her quilts were made in a mosaic style, using thousands of tiny half-inch pieces of fabric to create a picture.
I completely give the Lord the credit. They were inspirations from someplace, and there was no monkey business about it either. Because something ordinary wasn't going to please me at that time, don't you see? I needed a deep beauty in my life to protect some of the tougher ones, I can tell you that.
For many years, Emma displayed her quilts in her father's Prescott cigar store. In fact, it came to be called Emma's Happiness Museum. Quilt making has always been a family tradition. Mothers taught their daughters basic sewing skills as well as a love for fabric and color. The family tradition of making a quilt can sometimes be seen in one quilt. These red and white feathered stars were pieced by Nancy Frances Oliver in 1903 in Eden, Arizona. Nancy followed the Mormon migration from Illinois to Utah. As a young family, she and her husband pioneered various settlements, finally moving to Eden in 1888. Nancy Oliver gave the blocks to her daughter, Rilla Ann Oliver Curtis, who in turn gave them to her daughter, Laura Curtis Batty, who had been born in 1904. Laura, Nancy's granddaughter, finally stitched the blocks together and quilted the Feather Star Quilt in 1938. The quilt is now owned by Laura's daughter, Carole Weech, Nancy Oliver's great-granddaughter. Often the talent of quilt making is inherited along with the family quilts. Nancy Bradford Clark is a third-generation quilter, making contemporary artworks that have won national awards. Nancy's grandmother, Bessie Freeman Woods, was born in Louisiana, went to college in Texas, and moved to Tucson with her husband in about 1908. Bessie and her family owned and operated the Fairview Dairy in Tucson until 1960. She was also a prolific quilter.
My mother always had busy work in her hands, and she had what was called a scrap bag. And there was nothing in the scrap bag except new materials. She never made quilts from any material that was used.
She made this quilt for her daughter, Daisy, when she got married.
The thing I liked about her quilts, so many of her materials were scraps from things that she had made or I had made or that I knew someone who had used them. So it's lots of memories are tied up in a family quilt.
Daisy and Bessie worked together to piece this Lone Star quilt when Daisy was pregnant with Nancy. Nancy did not become interested in quilting until later in her life.
Growing up, they weren't anything special. I don't think that my grandmother would have been surprised to hear one of the grandchildren say that. But now, of course, they've become treasures.
Nancy's new quilts also have special meanings. This quilt was made for her son, David. He had a head injury from an automobile accident and was in a coma for 2 weeks and in the hospital for 2 months.
People kept saying, "What can I do?" And there was always a crowd of his friends or our friends at the hospital. And I got the idea because blankets are comforting. And I don't know how the hands jumped in there, but they did. But it came together very quickly, the idea. I came with my little basket of apples and food and scraps. We would trace hands of anybody that showed up. The people who were there did it. They traced their own, they traced somebody else's, and then cut those out.
3 friends helped Nancy do the applique and quilting.
And the 4 of us sat around the frame and laughed and worked out our lives. And for the first time, I got an idea of what quilting bees were about.
David finally recovered from his accident. And he gave the quilt its official name, Live Long and Prosper. Quilt making continues to be very much alive in Arizona today. New patterns and designs continue to evolve.
I think everybody has a quilt in them.
A quilt today is as likely to be found hanging on a wall as spread across a bed. And the quilt maker may be a Native American who learned the craft from her Anglo sisters and now makes it her own. Quilts today are a thread connecting us to our past, a tangible connection to our grandmothers, whispering to us, if we listen, about her life, her hardships, and her hopes, her sorrows, and her joys. Quilts are also part of the fabric of our future, teaching the values of yesterday to create a stronger tomorrow.